right, class, closing out part 4, Baroque and Rococo, circa 1600 to 1800. The 18th century, 1700 to 1790. 18th century French society, English society, and the American colonies. The French was very influential on fashion in the 17th century. The Baroque style was replaced by the delicate curvilinear forms of the Rococo in the last half of the century, followed by the revival of classical influences. Madame de Pompadour had a major influence on fashion in the years that King Louis XV reigned. During the reign of Louis XVI, the court became less important, particularly due to Queen Marie Antoinette feeling as though French court etiquette lacked expression. She eventually abandoned traditional court etiquette and opted for more extravagant dress accessorized with jewelry. She never wore the same garment twice in public. English society was less centered on court as compared to French society. Fashionable clothing was placed into categories that were based on the time of day the garment was worn or the occasion. Men's garments were divided amongst undress, which were your lounging clothes, dress, which was slightly formal outfits for daytime or evening, and full dress, which was mostly your formal evening dress. Nightgowns were used as dressing gowns or informal robes that were worn indoors. They were not worn to sleep in. A powdering jacket was used indoors to protect the clothing while the hair was being powdered. Men who paid great attention to their dress were called beaux. Men who adopted the French and Italian inspired fashions were called macaronis. Women's garments were divided amongst undress, half dress, or morning dress. A habit was a riding costume or a tailor made costume. The greatcoat was used for outdoors. By the end of the century, women were wearing a false rump, later referred to in the 19th century as a bustle. Americans imported British goods and followed European fashions that originated from Paris. American Quakers' dress was different than the masses. Men wore plain hats rather than wigs, and women wore simply shaped hats that were later replaced by unadorned bonnets. By the end of the 18th century, some Quakers began to give up their style of dress. The dress of the working class was designed with convenience in mind. Women wore a chemise, a petticoat skirt, and a short gown. Farmers and artisans wore loose smocks over breeches made from coarse linen or wool depending on the season. Clothing and textiles. Textiles derived from plant fibers or animals and included cotton or linen and wool or silk. Mechanized spinning devices were produced and cotton benefited from advances in technology. By the 18th century, affluent individuals were having their clothing made. However, the poor would purchase their clothing secondhand. Costume for men, 18th century. The major elements of men's dress was consistent throughout the century. However, the lines of styles of costume differed in the first and second half of the century. The major elements of men's costume included underdrawers, a shirt, waistcoat, an outer coat, knee-length breeches, hose, and shoes. Depending on the occasion, hats and wigs were also worn. Collars gathered at the neckband during the first half of the century. During the second half of the century, collars were longer, which eventually evolved into a collar that was sewn under the shirt. Up to the mid-18th century. Whether men were considered in dress or in full dress depended on how formal the item was. Items such as dress coats and breeches made from simplistic fabrics were considered dress items, while items made of elaborate fabrics were considered full dress. Breeches were cut moderately full and closed at the front with buttons. After 1730, breeches closed with a fall. This was a square central flap that buttoned at the waistline. Frock coats were cut looser and shorter than dress coats and had the flat, turned down collar. After 1770, they were worn as formal wear as well as country wear. Changes after the mid-18th century. Coat fullness decreased. Side pleats were eliminated, and the front of the coat was curved to the side. By the 1760s, a narrow stand-up collar had emerged. Silhouettes and sleeves had become narrow, and waistcoat fabric was the center of attention, being that coats were worn open. The waistcoat fabric was often made of brocades or had elaborate embroidery. Casual dress at home was Indian gowns or banyans. Hair and headdress. Most men wore wigs that were styled in various ways, but popular hairstyles of those wigs did include the French toupee, wigs with queues, and club wigs. For formal dress, powdered wigs were preferred. Due to the popularity of wigs, hats were of less importance. When hats were worn, the three-cornered hat style was the most popular. Other hats included the chapeau, which was not worn but rather carried under the arm. At home, men wore caps instead of wigs. Two of the more popular styles were a cap with a round crown and flat turned-up brim that fit close against the crown, or one with a shapeless crown and a rolled brim, somewhat turban-like. Footwear. Artificial calves were worn by men who sought to have their calves fashionably shaped. Until the 1720s, shoes were square-toed with high heels and large square tongues. Decorative buckles were put at the base of the shoe. Spatterdashers were added to the shoes and to be worn outdoors to protect the legs. Costume for women, 18th century. To obtain relief from corseting, jumps were worn at home as an undergarment. This garment was an unboned bodice. The shape of the hoop varied from 1710 to 1760. In 1710, they were cone-shaped and made of circles of whalebone sewn into petticoats, each hoop increasing in size as it moved near the floor. In the 1720s, the shape became rounded like a dome. In the 1730s, the favorite shape was narrower from the front to the back and wider from side to side. And by the 1740s, extreme widths were reached. Some hoops reached a width of 23/4 yards. These wide styles remained until the 1760s. 1715 through 1730. Unbelted gowns that were loose from the shoulder to the floor were referred to as sack. Robe battant and robe volant, as well as innocent. Pinners were circular hats with single or double frills around the edge. Mob caps had high puffed out crowns at the back and wide flat borders that encircled the face. This is an image of some various styles of gowns. (1730 to 1760). Two new styles were introduced. Robe à la Française, which was popular in France, had a long, loose, pleated black back and was worn over a stomacher. Robe à la L'Anglaise, which was popular in England, had a close fit in the front and back, feeding into a wider skirt, allowing for expansive amounts of textiles. Wide skirts showed off elaborate fabrics used for full dress. By the 1750s, hairstyles began to change, as hair was combed back off of the face and placed into a high bun on top of the head. The tête de mouton was another style of the times. This style consisted of close, tight curls that resembled a sheep's pelt. Hats worn outdoors were made of straw and had low crowns and wide brims. They were called bergeret or sheepherdess hats. 1760 to 1790. The robe à la Française was modified after 1770. By 1780, it was no longer in style. The robe à l'Anglaise was modified and worn in the 1780s. Gown styles included the polonaise, which was an overdress or a jacket that was cut without a waist seam. Closed or round gowns, which closed all the way down the front. Red and gold dresses resembled English riding coats with wide lapels or revers at the neck. Chemise à la reine were white muslin gowns that were made of very expensive muslin that was imported from India. Hair and headdress. Hairstyles became extreme. In the 1760s, hair was high and frizzed around the face. In the 1770s, hair reached its max size when tall structures were topped off with feathers, jewels, and ribbons. By the 1780s, height diminished, but the fullness was retained with the hedgehog fashion, which styled the hair curled, full and wide around the face, and had long locks that were hanging at the back. Indoor caps were no longer worn due to the hairstyles. For outdoors, hoods were made large enough to cover the hair. Clashes were made by sewing a series of semi-hoops into the hood. This prevented the hood from crushing the hair. Clashes were able to be folded when not in use. Other costume components, 18th century. Cloaks, some hooded, were full cut to fit over wide skirts. Overcoats were used in the last 2 decades and were cut like a man's greatcoat. Scarves, shawls, and wraps were made with and without sleeves. Larger versions covered the upper body, while smaller versions covered the shoulders and upper arms. Tippets, similar to modern-day soles, were worn around the shoulders. Mittens, unlike modern day, were cut without thumb and finger coverings. Costumes for children, 18th century. Infants were wrapped in swaddle clothes. From infancy to age 7, boys and girls both wore skirts. After age 6 or 7, boys and girls dressed like adults. Dress differed from previous or contemporary adult dress in the second half of the 18th century for children. Swaddling was abandoned by the end of the century. Boys aged 7 to 8 wore what was called a skeleton suit. This suit included long straight trousers, a white shirt with a wide collar that finished in a ruffled edge, and over the shirt was a jacket that was either a shorter or simplified version of those of adults of the cut to the waist and the double breast. Girls wore simple straight dresses, often made of muslin. Outdoor cloaks were worn. Mob caps were also worn indoors and outdoors. After age 11 or 12, both boys and girls dressed like adults. All right, class, this closes out part 4.